Hi, here we are with Chaucer in the late 14th century. Now, by doing this, of course, we have moved several hundred years, 400 years at least, since the time of the Beowulf poet, and perhaps even another 400 years from the events of Beowulf, and maybe perhaps its original construction as a poem. A lot has happened in 800 years. Most significantly, of course, is the Norman invasion of 1066. We all knew that, right? The Norman invasion, and the Normans were French, right? Northern French. And the Normans basically changed English. I mean, they changed all kinds of things, but we're not interested in that per se in this class. What we are interested in is language. By combining the Anglo-Saxon that had previously, been used, right, in the Beowulf era, right, that sort of very old English as we call it today, right, we get not modern, but we get a Middle English, which, quite honestly, at least in the language of Chaucer, is fairly recognizable. And anybody can read it with a little bit of help from some footnotes and a little glossary material. You don't have to be an English grad student or a specialist in historical English in order to read Chaucer in its original. Right? And that's one of the things that I like to encourage you to do as you encounter Chaucer. Now, I know that there are translations available into contemporary English. And I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be human if I didn't understand the desire to just cut through the mess and read that in the contemporary. But there's so much in the language of the original Chaucer that is so beautiful that you're truly missing out. At best, use both, right? Try to read what you can on your own and then maybe refer to contemporary translations if you want. Okay, that's all I want to say about that. I mean, I'm guilty of having read translations too, but to be very honest with you, it's not necessary. It just really, really isn't. Okay. Now, to talk about Chaucer, writing in the late 14th century, we have to talk about something very important that happened before that. And that's the Great Plague, the Black Death. Now, the Black Death comes, actually, there are several waves of plagues that hit Europe in the middle of the 14th century. COVID has nothing on the plague. Indeed, by some estimates, it is believed that perhaps as many as one-third of the population of Europe died during the plagues. I mean, that's an incredible, mind-boggling number. Okay. And because of that, you have enormous social changes. You can imagine. I mean, simple economics, right? You have less of something that you need. What happens? Well, price goes up, right? I mean, that's simple Econ 101. Well, what do we need? We need peasants, right? Nobility don't, do any work, right? All those lands, all the farms, all that is worked by the peasants. Now the peasants are not so plentiful, right? They've been wiped out. And increasingly what we're seeing as a result of this is a rising middle class, especially amongst people that have a trade, that have a skill. Weavers, millers, dyers as in dyeing tapestries and stuff like that. Indeed, in the Canterbury Tales, we have a whole bunch of characters who represent this rising new middle class with a wealth, or at least more financial means, if you will, than had previously been associated with them. This is one of the reasons they can, take a vacation, take a pilgrimage. Vacation is probably not the right word, because there's a religious aspect to this. You notice that some of the pilgrims, in fact, have hired a cook to come along with them on the trip and cook their meals for them, because they have the money to do it. Right? So that is a huge thing that has happened. Also, part of the background to Chaucer, we actually have to look to Italy. In Italy, you have the beginnings of what we're later going to call the Renaissance. A moving away from the medieval era. Now, at this point, particularly in England, we're still definitely medieval. Okay, we haven't moved. England's always like at the tail end of these movements. Italy tends to be at the forefront. And while all of these authors that I'm talking about are, shall we say, pretty firmly medieval, maybe I shouldn't say firmly, they kind of signify the end and the beginning, the end of a medieval era, beginning of another. So Dante, right? Dante Alighieri, who's born in 1265, dies in 1321. So he's, very early 14th century, and he writes, most importantly for us, the Inferno. Right? Dante's Inferno is the most well-known work, highly influential work, in which he envisions himself, a character of himself, going into hell, led by the Roman Virgil, and going down to the various parts of hell, where he sees real people that he assigns to various states of punishment. And the punishments in the Inferno tend to fit the crime, if you will. Okay. Another very important Italian is Francesco Petrarch. Now, Petrarch creates the sonnet, right, and the sonnet sequence. And we're going to talk about that more fully when we talk about Shakespeare's sonnets. But Petrarch is basically 14th century Italian, 1304 to 74? So he is a little bit younger than Chaucer, right? Maybe a couple generations younger, but he's still within that century. Okay, and the whole idea of the sonnet and this love, the love sonnets that he writes and creates, and the whole sequence of it, that is something that becomes incredibly popular, right? And Shakespeare was by far not the first. In fact, he was really late to the game in terms of writing sonnets. But the guy that we are most concerned with today from Italy is Giovanni Boccaccio. Now, Boccaccio, whose dates are 1313 to 1375, roughly the same time period as Petrarch, he writes a poem called the Decameron. And the idea of the Decameron is you have 10 people who are going to tell 10 stories, each 100 stories. Right? So this notion of storytelling, right, on a travel, on a trip, right, to pass the time, comes really from Boccaccio. But Chaucer makes it different, okay? Chaucer makes it different. Now let's talk about Chaucer for just a second. Chaucer is what, in our modern parlance, we would call a bureaucrat. He's not a noble, right, but he does represent this kind of rising group of people who are becoming wealthier and having access to people, i.e. the king and other nobles, and means of wealth production, i.e. land, that they had not really had before. Okay. Chaucer, he was, let's see, he was initially, right, he comes to our attention when he's taken prisoner during the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War is a series of wars between the French and the English, right, under Edward III. Edward III is very important later, just simply as a person. He's basically the king. When you start getting some of these wars of succession later on, which we're going to maybe talk about later when it becomes an issue in Shakespeare, everybody basically traces their lineage back to Edward III, right? He was taken prisoner and ransomed. Right. I mean, that's the whole business of taking prisoners, right? Is you get ransom money for them, right? So the fact that Chaucer was valuable enough for the king to pay the ransom, as opposed to just telling the French, "I don't care, take him. He's a pain in the butt." No, right? He paid for him. He serves under Richard II. Now, Richard II, of course, is the subject of one of Shakespeare's more famous plays. Not one that we have time to study this semester, I'm sorry. But hopefully you'll see him. Richard II is famous for being deposed. He was deposed by Henry IV. Henry IV was the son of John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was a friend of Chaucer's, right? They knew each other. They knew each other well. Eventually, Chaucer, as I said, he was a bureaucrat, and he made most of his money doing that. But eventually, he gets known for writing. Okay, and he wrote more than just the Canterbury Tales. But the Canterbury Tales, of course, are the apex of it all. He probably started writing these roughly in the 1380s, from best we can tell. Right. Now, the Canterbury Tales takes on the same idea as Decameron. Right, you have multiple characters. Right? In this case, we have about 30 characters. Pilgrims. Pilgrims who meet up to go to Canterbury, to the tomb of St. Thomas à Becket. Now, Thomas à Becket is the subject of actually a movie that's pretty old now, but you might wish to see it if you have some spare time, starring Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole. Burton plays Thomas à Becket, who is a cleric, a priest, eventually a bishop. Peter O'Toole plays Henry II. Henry II and Becket, at least according to the movie, I'm not sure that's true in real life, were running buddies when they were younger, but split apart in their older as they got into conflict. The conflict being the authority of the church versus the authority of the state. Okay, keep in mind this is long before separation of church and state. The king, Henry VIII, is claimed to have said, "Will no one rid me of this meddling priest?" And a couple of his knights murder Becket in church during Mass. Not a good move. As a matter of fact, it had the exact opposite effect. Opinion was so turned against the king that everything that he wanted to accomplish ultimately failed. Now, these pilgrims are going to the tomb of this person. Now, one of the things that's interesting in the poem is that they're going to the tomb as sort of a penance. They all have been at one point sick and prayed to St. Thomas à Becket. You know that, if you take this disease away from me, if I live through this, I will do a pilgrimage to your tomb. So all these pilgrims are doing that. But they all represent different levels of life. Unlike in the Decameron, when all the characters are nobles, in this story, the pilgrims are of different levels. The editors tell us it's very unlikely in real life they ever would have hung out together. But in Chaucer they do, from the knight all the way down to very low-level workers like the miller. And the characters' stories fit them, which is not true of the Decameron. Decameron, the stories are interchangeable. Please read